The Nobel Prize's biggest mistakes. Number 1. The transuranic elements. In 1938, Enrico Fermi travelled to Stockholm to collect the Nobel Prize in Physics. He was, without argument, one of the finest physicists who has ever lived. The committee honoured him for two things. One half of the award was for taming neutrons by slowing them down, a piece of work so sound it underpins reactors to this day. The other half was for discovering two brand new elements, heavier than uranium, that nobody had ever seen before. He had even given them names, orsonium and hesperium. There was a problem. 4 years earlier, a German chemist named Ida Noddack had read Fermi's results and suggested something quietly heretical, that the uranium might not be growing heavier at all, but breaking apart into lighter pieces. At the time, the nucleus was thought far too sturdy to shatter like that. Her paper was set aside. She had run no experiments of her own, and the physics establishment was not in the habit of taking corrections from a chemist. Within weeks of Fermi's lecture, a team in Berlin, Otto Hahn, Fritz Strassmann, Lisa Meitner and Otto Frisch, worked out what was happening. Fermi's mysterious new elements were not new elements at all. They were fragments. He had split the atom a full 4 years before anyone, himself included, realized the atom had been split. To his great credit, when he sent his Nobel lecture to the printer, he added a small footnote admitting the elements weren't there. It is, by some distance, the most expensive footnote in the history of physics. He would go on to build the first nuclear reactor, so the universe, in the end, let him keep the prize. Number 2. The cancer worm. Johannes Fibiger was a careful, respected Danish pathologist, which is what makes this one sting. Studying rats, he found tumours in their stomachs, and in the same animals he found a parasitic worm. He drew the obvious conclusion. The worm caused the cancer. He fed rats cockroaches carrying the parasite, watched the growths appear, and named his discovery Spiroptera carcinoma, the carcinoma worm. It looked like the first time anyone had deliberately produced cancer in a living animal. The Nobel Committee was enchanted. At the ceremony, they called his work a beacon of light in science's search for the truth. He was hailed as the man who had cracked open the cause of cancer itself. There was only one difficulty, and it would take a few years to surface. The worm does not cause cancer. Later researchers could not reproduce his results. The growths in his rats were, in the main, not cancer at all. They were tissue damage driven by a diet badly short of vitamin A. The worm had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And here is the unkind twist. The same year Fibiger was nominated, so was a Japanese pathologist, Katsusaburo Yamagiwa, who had produced real, unmistakable cancer by painting coal tar onto the ears of rabbits. True chemical carcinogenesis, the foundation of the field. The man who truly made cancer in a laboratory went home empty-handed. The worm got the Nobel. Number 3. DDT. Paul Hermann Müller was a Swiss chemist looking for something to keep moths out of woolens. After hundreds of failed attempts, he found a compound that killed insects on contact and seemed to humans almost perfectly harmless. It was called dichloro-diphenyl-trichloroethane, DDT. For this, he was given the Nobel Prize in Medicine, the only one ever awarded to a man with no medical training of any kind, for what began as a better moth spray. The committee had its reasons. Those reasons were sound. In the winter of 1944, a typhus epidemic was tearing through Naples. The first winter typhus outbreak ever stopped in its tracks, halted with DDT. It went on to push malaria out of whole regions, off entire islands, and out of the United States within a decade. Spray it once on a wall, and the mosquitoes died for months. For a while, it looked like one of the great gifts of the century, and the praise was deserved. Then the gift began to show its cost. DDT did not break down. It built up in soil, in water, in fish, and in the birds that ate them, thinning their eggshells until the eggs cracked under the weight of the parent. In 1962, the biologist Rachel Carson laid it all out in Silent Spring, and the modern environmental movement was born from the page. DDT was banned across much of the world within a decade. The prize was not wrong about what DDT could do. It was simply given before anyone had asked what else it would do. A reminder that saves lives and safe are not the same sentence.
Number 4. Streptomycin. In 1943, a graduate student at Rutgers named Albert Schatz was given a grim job. Tuberculosis was still a death sentence, and the search for something to kill it meant working with the live bacterium. So Schatz was put in a basement, alone, breathing the same air as the deadliest microbe he was trying to defeat. On his 11th experiment, he found it, a substance drawn from soil that stopped tuberculosis cold. He named it streptomycin. It was one of the most important drugs of the century. The laboratory belonged to Schatz's supervisor, Selman Waksman, a brilliant soil scientist who had assembled the collection the discovery came from. As streptomycin became famous, so did Waksman, and Schatz's name began to fade from the story. In his own accounts of the discovery, Waksman managed not to mention his student at all. When the Nobel came in 1952, it went to Waksman, and to Waksman alone. Schatz sued. In 1950, a New Jersey court formally recognized him as co-discoverer of streptomycin and awarded him a share of the royalties. But the Nobel Committee did not bend. They had ruled him a mere laboratory assistant, and that was that. Schatz never worked in a top microbiology lab again. The label troublemaker followed him for the rest of his career. Decades later, the Lancet would call the committee's omission a considerable mistake. He had done the work in a basement, with the deadliest bacterium he knew, on the 11th try. History filed him under assistant. Number 5. Malaria therapy. Before antibiotics, syphilis had a final stage that filled the asylums. It reached the brain, and the patient slid into paralysis, delusion, and death. It was called general paresis of the insane, and in some institutions it accounted for nearly a third of the inmates. There was no treatment. None. A patient who reached that stage was simply lost. The Austrian psychiatrist Julius Wagner-Jauregg had noticed something old and strange in the medical record, that patients who caught a raging fever sometimes recovered their minds. The bacterium behind syphilis cannot survive a high enough temperature, so he reached for the most reliable fever he could find and made a decision that is hard to read today. He deliberately infected his patients with malaria. He chose the milder strain, let the fever burn through several cycles, then cured the malaria with quinine. And it worked. Patients who had been condemned recovered enough to leave the wards. Some returned to their lives. For a quarter of a century, until penicillin made it unnecessary, deliberate malaria was the standard treatment for a fatal disease. This one is not a blunder, and it is not quite a triumph. The committee honored a cure that saved minds by handing patients another dangerous illness, a piece of medicine that worked, which is exactly what makes it sit so uneasily. Number 6. The lobotomy. In the 1930s, the great asylums were full, and there was almost nothing doctors could offer the most severely ill. Into that desperation stepped a distinguished Portuguese neurologist, António Egas Moniz. He had a theory that certain mental illnesses came from fixed, faulty connections in the front of the brain, and that if you severed those connections, the illness might lift. The operation was called prefrontal leucotomy. The world would come to know it as the lobotomy. The theory rested on very little, much of it traced back to 2 chimpanzees in another scientist's laboratory. After surgery, one had grown calmer, and the other had grown markedly worse. Moniz built his case on the first and set the second aside. He operated on 20 patients, reported them improved, and concluded that the procedure was simple and always safe. There were no long follow-ups, no proper accounting of what it cost the people it was done to. Within the field, the warnings began almost at once. Then, in 1949, the Nobel Committee gave Moniz its highest honor in medicine for the leucotomy. And a prize does not merely reward, it legitimizes. In America, a neurologist named Walter Freeman had already turned the operation into something faster and cruder, carried out in minutes, sometimes on people who could not consent. After the prize, the numbers climbed steeply. In the United States alone, tens of thousands of lobotomies were performed. Many patients were left quieter. A great many were left diminished, their personalities flattened, their selves somehow gone. One mother, describing her daughter after the surgery, said only, "She is my daughter, but yet a different person."
Within a few years, the first true psychiatric medicines arrived, and the lobotomy was abandoned almost everywhere. Petitions have been raised, more than once, asking the Nobel Foundation to take Moniz's prize back. It has declined each time. The award still stands, a permanent record of a moment when medicine's highest honor was given to one of its gravest mistakes. Like and subscribe if you'd like more videos like these. Every claim in this one is sourced in the description, along with where to read more. Cheers.